Hi guys, welcome to our rainwater collection class. I'm glad that you can join us. If you're not familiar with Keep Growing Detroit, we are a nonprofit in the city that is working. We have a 2-acre farm and we support gardeners across the city in their own gardening and farming operations. So we support them with seeds and plants to get them going. We also have all kind of gardening resources and tools and things that we support with. So just wanted to share a little bit about what we do. Today we have Keto. He's over in the greenhouse. Hey Keto, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, so we are talking about water conservation. I'm ready when you are. I'm on your first slide.
Okay. Terrific. Um, so, welcome everybody. Happy to have you out um, virtually. We're going to be talking about not only rainwater collection today, but water, just generally watering and vegetable garden watering needs, because it's kind of plays a big part of this. Um, some water conservation strategies and different options for water in the garden, irrigation, and and watering tools. All right, so if you can go to second slide here.
Okay.
Um, so to start, what do food crops need? Uh, Seeds need to be consistently moist until they germinate. So we need to keep, um, as we're working out in the garden, we got to make sure we basically, when we're managing watering the garden, we need to think about what's our strategy for watering in general. So when starting new seeds, we want to keep them consistently moist until they germinate. And then after they germinate, the general recommendation is about 1 inch of water per week, or one good thorough watering. Um, so generally, if we water too much in the garden, uh, that pushes the air out of the soil. If the water is super saturated, it pushes the air out, which the plants need to survive. So that they would become what's called anaerobic. And that can be a vector for fungus or uh, mold or rot. Um, uh, and then if we um, if we're watering too often, even if we're not, not somewhere in between too much and too little. If there's, the other thing is that too frequent watering causes plants to not seek out water, so the root systems will tend to stay shallow, and then in periods where the plants are dry, they can't recover as quickly because they don't have the extensive root system to go towards deeper water. So we're trying to encourage the root systems of the plants to go further as far in the ground as they can. Some plants are, by nature more shallow rooted, and then other plants are by nature more deep rooted. Tomatoes, for instance, are more of a slightly deeper rooted plant, where lettuce is an example of a really shallow rooted plant. Um, if we don't water enough, we can lose the vigor of the plants that we are trying to grow. So they'll be stunted. They will look not the appropriate color. They might look a little purple. Um, they just will look maybe a little anemic, like lighter green instead of a deep, rich green. And that's because the the um, water is the mechanism for plants to absorb the nutrients from the soil. And so the lack of the water, um, or adequate water can cause issues with nutrient uptake. Uh, and one common disease related to that is blossom end rot. If you've ever experienced tomatoes, in particular, it can apply to a couple different fruiting vegetables, but tomatoes in particular, there's on the end of the fruit where it becomes flat and sunken and kind of discolored. That is a lack of calcium, and that's because of, you know, it's kind of, usually there is adequate uh, calcium in the soil, but without the adequate watering to move that calcium into the plants, blossom and rot can be an issue.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we can keep going here. If there's questions, we can kind of answer them as we go, or we can wait till the end. Either way, I'm open to that. So moving on to slide 3 in my own slides. Okay. So now we're talking about how to go about watering. It may seem obvious, like just water the plants, just put water on them. But want to get into some of the specifics and to understand like the functionality of it, so we can water efficiently, not waste water, and give plants the best chance without risk. Okay, so as I had mentioned before, plants need about 1 inch of water per week, or one thorough watering. I like the term one thorough watering better because, you know, we're not out there with a rain gauge like watering our garden and trying to measure. It's not practical. One thorough watering is to get that water to really saturate into the soil so that the plants have a reserve, for the, you know, for the coming week. So the idea here is that we're trying to get that water to saturate about 6 inches into the soil, and that is where the root zone of where plants, most vegetable plants, you know, occupy, their root zones occupy the first 6 inches or so. Some rooting crops might go a little bit deeper, and then some leafing crops might be a little more shallow. Fruiting crops are also tend to be slightly more deep rooted. So as part of this, another kind of piece of the puzzle is that, in organic agriculture, in sustainable agriculture, we are looking at soil as a living thing. Soil has billions of microorganisms, functioning in the soil that help and work symbiotically with plants, and so we want to be taking care of the soil to be taking care of the plants, and a piece of that puzzle is keeping the soil adequately moist. If we let the soil dry out completely, the soil life was dormant or dies off, kind of any combination of things. There's lots of organisms. We're not going to get too specific about that, but just that we want to always keep some moisture in the soil. We never want it to dry out 100%. That poses a number of problems. You know, once if soil becomes like a desert, so super dry, it's like dust. We have virtually no life at that point, and it takes effort to bring the life back. Once we do, when we are trying to rehydrate it with water, it takes longer to hydrate, and it can cause, you know, it can be deceiving, because the water will tend to saturate only a little bit, and it'll look like you have a really good saturation, but if you scratch at the top of that, it's only gone down a half an inch. So we want to, so in that case, we need to water several times to get the water to really penetrate down to that 6 inches. So generally speaking, in technique, what the best way to water is, if you're watering by hand, is to water an entire area and then come back and water it again. So basically, if we using say this table of kale right here as an example. So well, I'm not, you know, or a large this is like a 8 by 12 12 foot area. So we would water this whole area once until the top of the soil begins to glisten, and then we would move on to our second area, water that thoroughly, same manner, and on and so forth throughout the entire garden, and then work your way back to the first spot and water it again. That allows that first watering to saturate into the soil, and then we hit it. You know, when you hit it the second time, you get that deeper penetration that we're talking about here. Um, um, okay, so moving on to the next slide. How often should I water? Generally speaking, we should be watering one, 1 to 3 times a week, and that at the very least 1 time a week. But then doing some maintenance watering based on what you see in the garden and the needs of the plants. And so, like I had mentioned earlier, um, in the case of seeds, that would be something that you would be watering more often just to keep that moisture. And one thing to think about with some seeds, carrots are a great example of this. They take a long time to germinate, and so a conservation strategy for when you're planting carrots is plant the seeds, water them, and then place a piece of cardboard or a piece of wood or something to cover that soil uh, to help keep the moisture in, because they take up to 2 weeks to germinate. So of course you got to make sure you come back before that 2 weeks is up and remove the wood, so you're not stunting their growth after they germinate. But that's a good way to keep the water in the soil, because otherwise open exposed soil is more prone to drying out quicker. Um, uh, during the hot summer months, expect to water more often. Um, in terms of time of day when we're supposed to water, best time of day is always the morning, because that allows for water to saturate into the soil and the plants to take it up before the heat of the day evaporates any of that off. But it does allow any leaf, like the upper part of plants that may have gotten wet, to dry out in the sun during the day, instead of if you did a nighttime watering. If those leaves got wet, it could be a vector for fungal problems, things like powdery mildew. How are we doing?
Doing good. The last bullet on this one is cut off.
Yeah, that's an open question. And then if you guys have anything you want to ask at this point, that's just for you.
Oh, okay.
I'm joking. Sorry, that's not the type. Next slide. Watering wisely in the garden. Watering options. Okay. So at the end of the presentation, we are going to go outside and demonstrate some of these things, but we'll just take a minute to talk them through. So generally speaking, we have two main options for getting water to the garden: from a house spigot, or from a rain barrel, a field barrel, or a water collection tank. So a house spigot, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. We have this, we're getting water from the city. It's pressurized. So that gives us a lot of different options about how we can use that water. And we'll get into the details in that in a second. But just to explain, rain barrels, field barrels, and water collection tanks are all low pressure situations. So those have more limited options about how we can get water to the plants. So running down the ways that we can water from a house spigot, very simply, low tech and simple is a watering can, and I'll show you later an example of a watering can I think is a really great example. And then from hoses, we can either do sprinklers, hand sprayers, soaker hoses, or drip irrigation, and I'll talk through the pros and cons of those again when we go outside. And then moving on from rain barrels, field barrels, and watering cans. I'm sorry, water collection tanks. We can either be watering the garden with watering cans, low flow drip irrigation, Um, the only way we're going to get pressure from these guys is if we have some kind of pump, which means we need electricity. And we cannot use a hose, sprinkler, standard drip irrigation unless without that pump. Okay, so again, rain collection options with rain barrels, field barrels, or water collection tanks is a great option, but you know, especially if we don't have any other access to water, but we just have to work with without, you know, pressure, because in most situations, if you don't have access to water, then likely you don't have access to electricity either for a pump. You know, I think just to explain really quick, I think everybody is pretty familiar with rain barrels, but a field barrel is a term that we use for if you use a 55-gallon tank like a rain barrel as a reserve for water on the garden. So, for example, if you if your community garden is across the street from your house, and there's no option for getting water from a hose from a spigot on either side, but there is, you know, you can drag a hose over there, but it's just kind of a pain. Then you could set up a 55-gallon drum or a 275-gallon tank or one of these types of tanks that you fill periodically to act as a reserve to water the garden. So you would take, you know, drag your hose across the street to fill it up, you know, every once in a while as a stopgap instead of having to lug water across the street all the time. Okay, moving on to the next slide. And then generally speaking, water conservation strategies. So, you know, I mentioned a few tips earlier in terms of timing of day. So watering earlier in the day is going to help conserve water. Other tips would be watering only where you need to water. So being specific, you know, not using a generalist watering tool like an oscillating sprinkler that goes back and forth and just waters everything in its footprint. But maybe you don't, maybe there's, you know, part of that garden that, you know, that's just got some perennials in it that don't require as much water. And if you're watering that area more than it's necessary, you're just introducing more of an option for weeds to take hold. Other things, probably the biggest tool for conserving water in the garden is using mulch. And when I say mulch, there's many options of this. Wood chips is the one I think that most commonly comes to mind. And wood chips are a tool, but not an ideal tool for mulching in our garden beds. The reason being is that wood chips are really high in carbon, and when they are incorporated into our soil, they could be a potential problem for tying up the nitrogen that is present in our soils, which our plants need to grow. And because that the carbon would bind with the nitrogen and start this kind of the decomposition process of those wood chips, which we want to happen, but we don't want to tie up that nitrogen. We want our plants to have access to that. And so, and the other thing, and this is just much, I guess, in a way, much more practical, is that wood chips are big and chunky. And if we're incorporating, and they take a longer time to break down in the soil. And so if we're mulching the top of the soil, and if they get mixed in with the soil at all, it just is not ideal to work with in terms of planting seeds. It makes it harder to make a nice seed bed. It makes it harder to plant in those beds. So more of those for perennial situations. Wood chips are really great for that. In terms of mulching on vegetable beds, straw is probably the champion. Straw and not hay. Hay is for horses. Hay has got seeds in it, and that could be a really annoying problem down the road. But straw is just the stems of the wheat or grass or whatever, and that really works real great because the way that it lays on the soil is really open to allow any kind of rain or watering to percolate through. It doesn't mat up, and it basically creates a blanket on the top of the soil to help keep the moisture inside. It helps keep weed pressure down as well, and because it's lighter in color, it'll tend to reflect the sunlight. Also, um, as a preventative measure for drying, from preventing drying out. Leaves are another really great option. Leaves, and those are something that are readily available in the fall. In my neighborhood, we have competitions with my other gardening friends in the neighborhood to who's got the most, who can pick up the most bags of leaves in the fall. I have been winning consistently for the past few years because Frank's really good at it. But in any case, those leaves that you collect, they work out okay as full leaves, and that is one option. It's an even better option to shred them up with a lawnmower because, again, it allows for better percolation into the soil. If they are full leaves, they will tend to mat, and that can cause problems.
Mildew.
With mildew and mold and whatever, and also any kind of plants that are trying to get through that, to grow through that. Which brings up the point of generally when you're applying mulch, we're trying to apply mulch not right up next to the plants. We want to give a little bit of space around the plants so it's not actually up touching the plants. It could be, in certain situations, it could be cause problems with slugs or other bugs who like to live in mulches. So you want to have it slightly, a little bit of opening and exposed soil right around the crown of the plants, in a seed bed as well. Usually you're letting your plants kind of get to a slightly larger size before you're really putting the mulch down, but you can always have it kind of laying in the sides, and ready to be pushing up against, up close to the plants when you're ready. But generally speaking, we want to have mulch on the soil all the time. We never want to have exposed soil. Okay, my audio went out. Can you hear me, T?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Your camera's frozen, but that's okay. You can keep going until the internet kicks back in.
Okay. All right. Other options for types of mulches are shredded paper. It's not as aesthetically appealing because it's really white and can look really kind of trashy in the garden, but it does work. Just shredded office paper, and then some people are working with plastic in the form of woven plastic, which can be used over and over and over again. And then larger scale farms are actually using plastic that they roll out in these big long rolls and then cutting holes in the plastic for planting their plants. And those are both viable uses for not only keeping weed pressure down, but also conserving on water needs. But they're just not as ideal, not as great for the environment because they're a petroleum product. The woven mesh plastic, I would say, is a better option because it can be reused year after year. And there are tools to actually burn holes in them. So you have, a setup for appropriate spacing, and people even set up their drip irrigation underneath the line and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Keita, your visual is all the way out now. We could switch cameras to your camera. There we go. Okay. All right. Somebody was asking about using coffee bags for mulch.
Yeah. Yes. So coffee bags work great. the only kind of the downside of coffee bags is they tend to have a wicking action, which basically um, acts as like the water. If they get really dried out, the water will absorb up into any free available water will absorb into the coffee bag. So it could be just it could be pose problems, but it's still a viable option. So something to toy with. Um, so that would be something to consider. Any other questions?
No, we can keep going.
Okay, next slide. All right. So now we are talking about how much water does my garden need. Give me 1 second here.
Did you get hot up in there?
What's that?
So did you get hot, Keto?
Yeah, the sun is coming out in this
I
greenhouse and it's warming up.
I see.
All right. So now we're starting to talk about what to think about when we're getting a plan together for setting up a rainwater catchment system. So the first, before we're as we're thinking about what to get um, and what kind of tanks and what kind of system and how we're going to get this water and whatever, we need to know how much water does the garden need, and so we're going to use that number that we talked about, or the reference that we talked about earlier, of a general recommendation of 1 inch of water a week to work out some calculations. So we start by figuring out the area of the garden. So go to the next slide. Very simply, we are calculating the length and width of the garden to get to square footage. So we are using an example here of a 20-foot wide and 20-foot long garden, which is 400 square feet. Next slide. Okay, and so we take that area, and now we know that we're looking at for a month we need 4 inches of water, 1 inch a week, and we're going to take this calculation, which is take the square footage, multiply it by 0.623, and that number is basically how to take that 1 inch per square foot and calculate it into gallons, and you multiply that by weeks. Okay, so in this case, following that line, we're taking 400 times 0.623 times 4, and that's telling me that for my 400 square foot garden, I need approximately almost 1,000 gallons of water. It's amazing. Every time I do these calculations, I'm just like, wow, that's a lot of water. But fortunately, Mother Nature does help us out in Michigan here, and we have some regular rains. So let's get to the next slide here. If you look at the average precipitation in inches, and if we think about the growings in, starting at March and April, we're looking at 2 or 3 inches a month, and kind of averaging, through July, August, September, October. I mean, basically, next slide, we're looking at 2 to 3 inches a month is what the average is in Michigan. And so that's about 40 to 60% of our water needs. And just as, a general rule, make it slightly simpler, we're going to know that, based on looking at the weather, we know that Detroit's average rainfall is covering about 2 to 3 inches a month, which is, about 50%. We're going to say 40 to 65% of our water needs, but just for our purposes, we'll just use 50% as a rough estimate, just to keep it simple. So that being said, we just multiply 50% times the gallons we need for a month to discount, to calculate that what we're going to get from rainfall, and which brings our 400 square foot garden needing about just under 500 gallons of water a month. And so um, in the same way, we can use these calculations to figure out what the potential capture we can get from any size given roof. And this is really helpful when we're trying to size out the type of tanks that we need. Because, for example, rain barrels are really popular, and we value that. It's educating people about reusing rainwater. But the reality is that a 55-gallon drum and 1 inch of rain on a standard house roof is going to fill up in seconds, and then it's going to be overflowing. So it's, in terms of the potential that how much rainwater we could capture off of a standard house roof is much more than 55 gallons. But essentially, to find that out, we measure the square footage of our roof and multiply it by that same conversion factor, 0.0623, 0.623, and that will give us how much water we could collect off of that roof in an inch of rain. And so if we're anticipating, so that's a really useful knowledge. Move on to the next slide here. So Keep Growing Detroit, we've been working really hard, and we put together a rainwater catchment safety and use tip sheet, which we will attach. You'll get with the slides here, but you will also get a copy of it independently to have reference for when you're putting together a system. We've covered a lot of this stuff, but I do want to talk about safety options, being safe with water. And just one thing to reference here is that rainwater is great. We really, it's going to be a valuable tool to use in the garden to keep water. And of course, Mother Nature gives us rainwater all the time. But once we're capturing water off of a roof and storing it for extended periods of time or any length of time, it is a potential vector for things that that we don't want to ingest. So this rainwater is absolutely not potable. It's not something that we should be drinking. It's not something we should be using for washing our vegetables. It's not something that we should be even using for washing our hands, because the residues and dirts that accumulate on roofs, combined with potential fecal matter of birds, and then that and flowing over off of that and then going into a tank and sitting for an extended time could have potential concerns for human safety in terms of ingestion. Watering our plants with that is not a problem. And again, but the focus is watering the plants at the root zone. And if you do get this water on the leaves of the plants, wash them very well before you ingest them. So that's just a general thing that we do want to make sure people are being safe with. And generally speaking, watering at the roots of the plant is the best way to water anyways. And we'll talk about that a little more when we're demonstrating some of the tools outside. Some of the water catchment system pros and cons. The ability to have a water available independent of the city water system. This diverts water from our overtaxed sewer system, and they're relatively easy to set up. Particularly, there's a few different options, and we'll talk those through. Some are a lot easier than others, but they're not, it's not rocket science. The cons, as I had mentioned earlier, this is a situation where you're not getting pressure from any kind of watering system. And so without a system of some kind of pump, then you either have to use a watering can or some kind of low flow irrigation system, which we'll talk about a little bit when we go outside. And they do require seasonal maintenance. Okay, so this is coming back. This is what I had mentioned earlier. This is illustrating how much water I can collect from my roof. So, you know, as I had mentioned earlier, same kind of conversion factor. So that's just a visual representation if you want to, for future reference. Okay. So the first style of rain catchment system is capturing water from an existing roof. And I just want to emphasize that this is the best option for many reasons. So the best option, one, because you can hands down build a system that capturing off of an existing roof that gets the most water for the least amount of cost. Because you already got a surface, you know, the surface of whatever you're capturing out of dictates how much water you're going to get. And we will talk about freestanding systems in a second, but a freestanding system, you know, the roofs are much smaller. So, and it takes money to build that, just that freestanding system. So you're not going to get the return on investment that you would in capturing from an existing roof. They're relatively easy to set up. It's just a matter of channeling, figuring out a gutter that's closest to your garden. That's probably the trickiest part. Is there a gutter that is in good, you know, proximity to where the garden is, where the system could be installed? So you can see on the picture here on the left, that is off of a roof that is approximately, I think it was like 30 by 100. And we have 3 275-gallon tanks set up there. And it works out really well that they're unified. They have, and basically how these are set up is we just ran that gutter down. We pitched all of the gutters on the house to move to one part of the house. So we ran, it's a one-story house. We ran the gutter all the way around the house, and they're all pitching to one gutter to channel all of that water into the tanks. Because in a situation where you have, you know, typically on a house, you have gutters on either side. So, and you know, this side of the roof, the pitch of this roof is gutter, you know, it's going out of that downspout, and this side to this downspout. So your water potential is split in half unless you have a tank. And you know, that's, you know, factoring the distance from the garden and all that stuff. So this one we set up to try and get the full potential of the roof in this situation. And we set up the bottoms of the tanks to fill. So using PVC, we came out of each of the fronts of the tanks. So the first tank fills up, and then as it fills up, it goes out of that PVC into the second and third tank. So they all fill up simultaneously. And we found that that's the best way to gang the systems together, because if you try and do it from an overflow at the top, the water pressure does not work out as well to move them from tank to tank. So this is a little bit easier in terms of maintenance and function.
That makes sense.
All right, moving on to the next slide here. So this is the other main example of our water collection system, is a freestanding structure. This is images of our what we call the irrigation station. So the one on the left is a single unit, and the one on the right is a double unit, two side by side. We designed these to be as relatively easy to build, and cost effective as possible, and to try and avoid having to have a building permit. So there may be more information coming down the road for having to get permits for irrigation systems in the city. We're finding out more information about that as we speak. But we got each one of these is 8 foot wide and 12 foot long, which can, in an average rainfall, capture about 75 to 100 gallons of water. And so that's not nearly, as I mentioned before, not nearly as much as off of a standard roof. But these are really great because for other reasons, and functionally they can serve other purposes in a garden. For example, you would set this up likely right next to the garden, so the water was right next to the garden as well, which also works really well to be a shaded spot for sitting and gathering with other gardeners. It's a really nice, you can set up a picnic table or two underneath there. So for hot summer days, take a break after you're doing some gardening. They can also be used for wash pack, which is also really nice. So in terms of costing on these, for a single unit with the tank and the stand and everything, you're talking somewhere between $750 and $1,000 per unit. The stand itself is somewhere around $100. Those 275 gallon tanks are usually $50 to $100 based on getting them, sourcing them, and we'll talk about sources in a minute here. So
just to be clear, you're saying 750 to 1,000 for just the one that you have on the left here, right?
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if we could move down to next slide here. Other options, one other option if you have a hoop house or you're involved with anybody who has got a hoop house, you can set up a gutter system on hoop houses like we did here at the KGD farm. So these two greenhouses at the farm here are 30 feet wide and 144 feet long. So that's a huge area of roof. We set up gutters and on either side that we take down every winter. The snow load could just, we have to take them down in the winter because snow sloughing off the top of the roof could tear off the gutters. But basically we just set them up this spring again, and we're collecting the water for each house in two 1,100 gallon tanks, which in an average rainfall of 1 to 2 inches will fill up. So every time we get a rain, we'll get between the two houses almost 5,000 gallons of water. So you'll notice here, these are a few pointers here that are really helpful for setting up any system that we are strongly advising people to use. So one is to make sure that you put some kind of signage on your tank that says not potable water. We do have a stencil that we had made for that purpose, and we can help you either spray painting it onto a piece of plywood or a piece of laminate, or you could borrow the stencil if that's something that GRP members are interested in doing. To make sure, the second thing to do is make sure your tank is translucent or painted. So in this case, you see here a tank that's already solid black, but if you're getting those 275 gallon tanks, we'll look at those in a minute. Be sure and paint them with some kind of paint that will adhere to plastic. We found that spray paint is probably one of the better options. Usually it takes 2 to 3 cans of spray paint to paint one of those 275-gallon tanks. And the third thing here to point out is some kind of screen filter at the inlet of the tank to prevent debris from getting inside the tank and fermenting and causing problems with the water. Before I move on here, I want to just take a second and talk about water storage. We are generally advising people to use water up on a regular basis. We never want to be storing water beyond 2 weeks because as the water sits, it will be, start to build up bacteria, and which is a concern for not only our health, but as it builds up, it could be a problem for applying to the garden. So that we're also, so if you could click, and we'll reference the next slide here in reference for that. So we talked about some of these things, but towards the bottom here, be sure to add, I wanted to get the numbers right. So if you are storing the water and want to try and keep it going, we advise 1 ounce of bleach per 55 gallons of water. So, in a 55-gallon drum, that would be 1 ounce. And in a 275-gallon tank, that would be roughly 4, 5, 6 ounces of bleach, and you would reapply that at no more than on a monthly basis, and let it set, stir it up and let it set for at least 24 hours before you use that water.
These guides are a little bit tricky to see, but I just want folks to know we'll send them out when you register. If you register for the webinar, we'll send this out to you.
Okay. And then other pieces of the puzzle before we start to head outside is ongoing maintenance with these systems. Actually, before I move on, also included with attachment that T is going to share is on our website is also available plans for the irrigation station on how to build them, including materials list and steps in the process and how to build the freestanding structure, the irrigation station that we referenced earlier. And then, general maintenance for these things is probably, we advise that people clean out their tanks at least once a season with some kind of long-handled brush, trying to get all the algae that may have formed on the inside, or any kind of buildup, rinsing that stuff out. At the end of the season, we want to winterize it, which means you want to drain all of the water out and leave the spigot open and divert the downspout that was going into the top of the tank off to the side. Other things would just be to kind of roll up any hoses or related materials and store all kinds of any kind of hoses, watering cans, water spigots, etc., and bring that stuff inside for the winter. Don't leave it out in the garden. Clicking to the next slide here. So this is just referencing never store water for long periods of time. And then let's keep moving here. The next slide. Here is a reference for some resources. Generally speaking, for purchasing totes, tanks, and rain barrels, There's not really a great local resource. There used to be a place called Maxi Container, but to my knowledge, they are no longer operational. But that would be something to pursue. I tried checking in on their website, and it didn't seem like they were open. So, but the other places to check around with would be local breweries and distilleries. Sometimes they have 55-gallon drums and 275-gallon drums. Regardless of where you get them from, be sure to make sure that it's food grade and it didn't store any kind of chemicals or solvents or detergents, because those could, cause problems with watering the plants. I have consistently seen listings for them on places like Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace. And then if you're interested in the larger tanks, like the ones, we'll just show some images, we'll show some video when we go outside, like anywhere from 100 to 1,000 gallon tanks. We found the National Tank Outlet have pretty good pricing. They have, and be sure they have a way to look on their website for different sizes. But if you're really trying to price it out seriously, call them up, because I found that, like, I thought I had a good price. I called them up and told them what I was interested in, and they were even able to give me a better price than I had initially anticipated. So that was good. Okay, so I'm just going to click to this last slide just so you can see that's my email address. If you happen to have any specific questions occur to you later on in time. And then we'll take the rest of this time today to want to go over some visual stuff outside, so a little bit of demonstration, and just to give you a little bit more of a visual of what we're doing to collect rainwater from our greenhouses here at the farm. And then if there's any questions at the end, we'll open it up. And you can also do that via the chat. All right. So we're going to stand up here and start to transition outside. Okay, can you still hear me good?
Yep, I got you. Let me make your video bigger.
I guess just to do scale really quick, just the this is of course an example of a rain barrel, and we discussed earlier, if this is all you got access to, it's all right. We generally just do not recommend them. We just have not, just because, as I had mentioned earlier, it's a drop in the bucket from what you could capture, and also in terms of what a garden needs. You saw those numbers that I calculated earlier. A 20 by 20 garden needs, upwards of 500 gallons of water in a month, and that would be 10 of these rain barrels to be able to stay on top of that. This is in terms of like locally accessible and the and just functionality. These 275 gallon totes are definitely a really great option. This is 1100 gallon tanks that we purchased from National Tank Outlet. Okay, so I wanted to illustrate a few of the options for watering that we do in the garden. A little bit of a rundown on those. So first off, for hand watering, actually let me walk over here, sorry. First off, for hand watering, there's nothing better than a really good watering can. Okay, this is a Hawes watering can, or I'm sorry, it's a Dram. I'm lying here.
You said the wind was breaking up. So you said DRAM, right?
Yeah, DRAMM. And these are nice watering cans that you can often find at garden centers. I would say locally, probably the best place locally would be English Gardens. I think might carry them, and you can probably order them online from places like, oh boy, I'm not thinking of a place right now. In any case, so this would be as if you were watering from a hose, but really, when watering new seeds, this is a really great option. It gives the ability to do more of a shower onto the plants, which, especially for new seeds, is a really great option. We want that gentle watering. We don't want to blast the soil. And this is also a really good tool for watering things in to get them established. Second option here is when we're working towards hoses and things that we're connecting to hoses. I would say a watering wand is probably one of the best options out there. Watering wands are really great because they allow us to water right at the base of the plants, as we had mentioned earlier. Generally speaking, we do not need, no plant really needs its leaves to be wet ever. Of course, Mother Nature does that when it rains, and that's unavoidable, but we're really concerned about saturating the soil, and we can be really specific when we have something like a watering wand like this. So and go right to the source. And so, you know, if this is my plant here, I'm spending some time here and letting that really sink in, and then I come over to this plant and watering it until it really sinks in, and so on and so forth. And then, you know, kind of following my strategy earlier, it's like you can move that space again and get that deep saturation. Whereas, you know, all these areas around it that were maybe open, I haven't planted yet, I don't need to water those areas because I don't have any plants. A few other options of watering at the soil level are something like soaker hose. This is basically made out of recycled tires, and what is happening here is it's a perforated recycled tire hose that allows the water to just seep out along it. And so this water is at the root zone. You would just leave this running for an extended period of time and to really soak into the soil. So that's a really conservative method. You definitely need to have water pressure to do that. The upside is that these are they're readily available. You can find them at any of the big box stores. Downside is if the ground is uneven at all, the watering is somewhat inconsistent that comes out of this. It's just perforated. It's not engineered to be very specific. And then the other option I wanted to show here is this is a drip irrigation system. So this is what on a larger scale garden or farm what would be used. Basically, we would set out this line, which is called a header, at the base of where your rows of your garden are going to be. And each one of these, so these would be dedicated to one row of plants, and you would be hooking up what's called drip tape. So this is engineered to have holes every 6 inches. And so you would connect this up to these outlets and run it the length of the beds that you have. In this case, we're running 2 lines per row. And so this is a very specific root zone watering system that's very, very efficient and helps with water conservation. So that's a really great option for larger scale farms. But if you don't have water pressure, then you can use something like a low flow irrigation kit. These can be found at Chapin Living Waters, CHAPIN Living Waters, Chapin Living Waters. And basically, these are designed to work. They call it a bucket kit, but it's designed to work on low pressure in situations like using a 275-gallon tank, or even any one of these tank options connected to a similar style header, like we're talking like with the drip irrigation kit, and then lines leading off of it. So for these cost, I think this one's for size. These cost about $50 to $100. I think this one's set up for. This one was $80, and it's got 100 feet of flat tape. So this could be used for a pretty nice sized garden, probably 30 by 30 garden. For the kit would cost about $85. And then the other kind of watering tools, common watering tools, are fine, like hose sprayers and misters and such. But they're not going to get that consistent watering that you want for any one part of the garden. And they're not very specific. They work okay, but you work with what you got. But ideal situations is having some kind of shower head, as I had mentioned before. And then I just want to point out that watering tools like the oscillating sprinkler or the impact sprinkler, these were really not designed for watering things like vegetable gardens. They're more something like for a lawn. They're generalist waterers, so they're very inefficient in terms of water. They're going to water an entire swath of land. If it's what you got and you don't have much time to stand out there and water, yes, use them, but they're just really not. You lose a lot of water just blowing off into the air when you just set them up and leave them go. Mm-hmm. So not very efficient.
Question, Keto, on the tanks, on the bigger tanks, are you recommending some type of pump or something for aeration in there?
Aeration? No. No. I don't think you need to aerate this. We use pumps to. I can show you an example of the pumps that we use to irrigate from out of these tanks. This is a Rainfall pump, which I think I put in a note on in the resources. But this does 800 gallons per hour, and it's a sub pump, so it turns on when this thing is flipped up. So it's nice to be able to set it up so it turns off automatically if the water is too low. And we set this up basically for these fields that out here. We set this up to connect to that drip irrigation line. You need to have, there's a few more pieces that you need to set that up, including a pressure regulator and a filter. and then basically we set lines out, the header out, 2 lines per bed, and just let it run. At this time of year, though, we're using we're using these pumps to, because we don't need that much water in the field. We're using these pumps to manage water in the garden. Like basically, we have issues with standing water in front of the farm, and all the rain that comes on the roof of the greenhouses, if we don't manage it, ends up causing issues with flooding and standing water on the front side of the farm. So we've been just managing water by putting it into the back 40 where the water is saturated in the soil in the fields that we're planning to grow stuff. So I think that's mostly what I had on my mind. Any more questions? Maybe we can go in the greenhouse so you can hear me better.
Yeah, I think we're good. Thanks so much, Keto. So for folks who are listening, I'll send over the few documents that you saw in the PowerPoint. I'm going to send out a link to that irrigation station manual to build, and the recording for this. So thanks for tuning in with us. We'll be doing this every Saturday through April at 1 p.m. So all of the links are on our website. If you want to join us for some of these free webinars through April, while we're all enduring this this crisis together, want to make sure that you're keeping growing. Okay, so thanks so much, Keto. Thanks, Danielle.
Bye, guys.
Bye.